online stories.
Okay. So basically, to respond to the same question in a similar way, so an event in the Indian context that can draw parallels to the Holocaust is the Great Partition that happened of the Indian subcontinent. And like Peter said, that there was obviously a dearth of material available, especially through media representation or state dialogues and narratives, to give visibility to the kind of trauma that happened and to the kind of atrocities that people underwent. There was this silence around it, and it was still very late that the state narrative talked about this whole idea of rehabilitation missions. The narrative went like, rehabilitate people who have been traumatized, and the archive that was available of partition as an event also talked basically about facts and figures and numbers, the number of people who crossed the border, the number of people who died, etc., etc. So I'm sure you must have all read this book by Urvashi Batalia called The Other Side of Silence, which then talked about women's narratives and giving voices to women who were part of this trauma. Though one event that did give certain visibility to the partition drama was partition violence, was the genre of short stories. So those were the short stories of people like Manto and others who were giving them certain kind of visibility to this kind of violence that was happening. But women's voices or the trauma that women's bodies underwent did not get visibility, and especially in performance space, it did not. So one of the directors that I'll talk about later today is Kirti Jain, who came up with this production called How Many Fragments More, basically a translation of Aur Kitne Tukde, where she tries to create a certain kind of bodily archival representation of these women and their voices and narrative to show the kind of trauma that they had underwent during partition. Now, like Peter said that, how do you talk about it? So till a very long time, there was this silence around it because women didn't want to talk about it. People didn't want to archive it or even document it because it went against the state policy of the whole idea of rehabilitation. So we have now we have a lot of writing available on questioning this kind of recording and archiving, and theatre definitely serves as a medium to give that kind of representation. And post Aur Kitne Tukde, there have been a number of performances and presentations that deal with this kind of silence, that to address trauma.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah.
It's more sort of a comment or it's the thing. Like when you're talking about Orientalism.
Sorry, you need to speak up. I apologize.
So when you're talking about this whole thing of Orientalism and all, so I get when a foreign scholar talks about it, like I get ki wo I get I understand that thing, but when the confusion starts when suppose Indian scholar who might be coming from a particular caste group and all, and when they use this terminology, so obviously Orientalism is there, we can use that thing, but by just using that Orientalism as only one whole word, like they are systematically hiding the question of caste. I think I don't know that's that.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
I asked this question to Vishnu ma'am also. I'm just repeating this thing. This question is about writing. No, like suppose I'm writing, diary sort of a thing. Ki, I'm writing whatever I feel. Writing and all those things. But again, that whole there is this whole thing called incorporeality, whatever you are feeling, that is you want to write on, and like how to convert that thing, how to, if I'm not putting the question rightly, or I don't know, like how to put that thing, academically, or how to convert that thing. It's thank you.
Thank you so much. I will just sort of repeat it for the class a little bit louder, if you don't mind. So the first comment was that the term Orientalism sort of might obscure the question of caste, especially when used in an inner Indian context. And I'll sort of pass that on to my three colleagues to comment on that, or to add up on that. But I would like to connect it with your second question. The second question was that how does one convert one's personal notes? And I think we could broaden this in the general sense. How do we convert our individual curiosity, what sort of we think as important, into something that is an properly academic publication? And I assume you're not the only one who has asked him or herself that question. And I think it relates to a certain extent to your first point. Something that I personally, as a scholar and researcher, but also I try to avoid the term teacher, because I never wanted to be a teacher. Someone who does workshops or meets people in a room. I increasingly find important is that we start with the acknowledgement how difficult it is to find the language to speak about things that we are interested in. And I think there's a process from the individual curiosity, something that sort of is on your mind, something that sort of keeps haunting you, and something you feel you need to go down to really to understand it, and turning this from an individual, sometimes idiosyncratic obsession into something that communicates in the academic community. And I think it has to do with this question of language, where the question of Orientalism, this is at least the thing I can speak to, might have to do with. So I think this conversion starts with trying to understand what we are interested in. Sometimes, especially when one deals with aesthetic products, it's a question of taste, or something that appeals to us, something we feel a connection to in one way or the other. And I think it's an important process to admit this personal liking, that this is something we have a preference for, but also trying to understand why this is something that seems to be important to us. I'm sure all of you have the experience, had the experience at a certain time and point that you've sat in a theater and you suddenly felt, this is important. This is something that sort of is outstanding, and it's different from the many other evenings in theaters where you start to realize that your back aches, and that the seats are extremely uncomfortable, and that your neighbor is snoring, and that you could have do something else with your time. There are these magic moments when we sort of feel this is something that sort of communicates to us individually or collectively. But I think it's equally important to try to understand where this comes from. And then here I would go back to my earlier point, trying to understand the constellation out of which this interest arises. How much of that fascination is really an individual choice that I might communicate to friends and people close to me, but how much also might relate to larger questions other people discuss as well. So I think this process of trying, this is at least something I try to do with my Cologne students, is trying to get them to the point to formulate the question they actually want to answer. Because very often we start with a fascination, someone saying, I find this particularly interesting. Aha, okay, but what is the question you want to answer? So the way from fascination to question, I think, is halfway to get to a good academic paper. And then there's a lot of technicalities, exploring the constellation, really trying to get to the deeper foundation of what is informing, what is fueling, what interests you. And this I think is why the question of historiography is so important, because for a very long time people thought writing history means to write down everything about the past you can get hold of. German theater histories of the 19th century, almost unreadable. And I think I can fairly say this because I tried to read it. But these are not texts, they don't make an argument, they don't tell any story, they just add date to date to date to date, and trivia and important things. But historiography starts with a sense of discovering, how do I discover larger patterns? How do I discover something that relates to larger questions? So chronology is not an argument. Chronology might be helpful and sometimes even might be necessary, but it's also not a way of writing history. This is a way of storing data. And I think especially at a time when so many sources are available digitally that you easily can flood yourself, it is important to get to this deeper point to understand your fascination and to convert your fascination into a question. Does that help? Orientalism at CAS?
Okay, that is a question that should have been asked last semester when you were in my class, but no. But very broadly, I'm not going to attempt to answer it like that, but I would say one of the things that I guess the term Orientalism, it is theorized, it's a particular kind of theoretical position. One could, it makes manifest certain kinds and styles of power. That is what it does. And when it was Edward Said sort of coined the term, really one of the most influential books of 20th century, right? It is one book that has changed kind of the landscape of academic discourse, and we should ask why it might be so. And post-colonial theory kind of center stage of a lot of things that have happened, kind of in the last 40 years is because of the book called Orientalism. So it does make visible something very, very concrete, which is not restricted to India, which is not restricted to Africa, which is not restricted to the Americas, but which brings together, Middle East, all of that together into kind of one sort of very, very important kind of critical position. And it is to kind of highlight how West produces Orient as a subject, but not as a subject of free thought, that it is West itself, it's an after effect of that production of the West is what is Orient. Now, that is a really very, very powerful, very kind of influential theory. There are limits, of course there are limits to theory, and you should follow up if you want to go to that trajectory. There are a lot of critiques of Saidian formulations of Orientalism from the locations which are kind of marked as the Orient, to kind of argue whether it is this sort of idea, this sort of really kind of systemic almost, that you can't think outside the lens of Orientalism. Is it true? Is it correct to kind of have that proposition? How do we place works and thinkings happening in these sort of Orient? There is a lot of critique of that sort, and there's a different traditions of that critique which have been done. So I think those are kind of theoretical debates I think you should be kind of looking for. Now within that cast could be one kind of proposition to kind of think about, but I would say that at least there are certain kind of styles, or there are certain kind of performances, at least in what I kind of look at theater and performance cultures, where you can kind of, if it is not so, even if it is not so overarching to kind of have every kind of practice which is happening in the Orient as kind of the effect of Orientalism or caught up within Orientalism, you can really identify certain kind of practices which is clearly kind of within the style of Orientalism, which I would kind of which is very visible. Now, whether it's a German style, all of this also stylistically kind of different, German Orient. That's why we kind of name almost French Orientalism, German style Orientalism, etc. So I think there is some kind of productive way to kind of really mark some of these works that are happening, and that is why a lot of construction, because it does affect Orientalism in certain ways, really is deep. Goes to the heart of Indian nation and its academic policies, academic thinkings, because a lot of institutions that have come up are also kind of probably caught up with logics of Orientalism. Now, caste is something that you could ask about it, but within this stylistics or at least what Said would say, probably the issue is that there are, of course, Britishers knew there are different castes. They really played on it, to the level of certain, theories which I don't subscribe to, which would say caste is a colonial construct. I don't subscribe to it, but there are positions like that because it is British colonialism which kind of changed the whole ways of we think about identity. And that is kind of a historical event that has sort of really given us these identities as we kind of experience in this point. Now, that is sort of, in a sense, when we are kind of looking in the context of India. So there are ways in which you could kind of look at that sort of problem of how Orientalism, in fact, in certain ways construct. But also Orientalism, on the other hand, probably for Said, categories like caste might not necessarily be the obvious ones that he's picking up. But also the argument that there is some construction of an Orient, which is not restricted to India, which is not restricted to Africa, which is not restricted to Japan. All of them are brought under this sort of really strange, kind of fictitious, imaginative construct, very powerful construct called Orient, and that is done by Western powers because it is the heart of power. So it's a historical transformation, it's a effect of power, and which creates this category of Orient. So for them, a Chinese, a Japanese, or what we understand as a Chinese, a Japanese, an Indian, an African, are all these other subjects. So for them, that maybe those gradations might not necessarily, for us, living here in certain place, certain locations, now felt power, you go somewhere else. Certain kind of really scales that, you have a larger power which kind of neutralizes everybody's this. So there is also that part of Orientalism, I think, is in a certain way, like invisibilizing other kinds of hierarchy, because it actually creates its own kind of hierarchies and kind of, what he powerfully says, therefore a desire and disgust kind of together in Orientalism. I think that's my kind of broad response to it, if it makes sense. If I may ask one question, too, because we are talking about critical media, history, which has been an important category. Could you just elaborate a bit on the notion of media? How do you define it? Because one of the things that we have, media is communication, media is certain kind of questions, and that's something that is different from, say, theorizations of performance, say, Schechner kind of tradition, Schechner, Joseph Rhodes, Nana Taylor, that kind of tradition who picks up, because, say, a ritual, which is the category of transformation, certain other categories are working in those sort of definition. So would a certain kind of, say, God, a performance of, say, a ritual, etc., how does it become part of media in your kind of imagination? That.
Thank you so much. Let me sort of try to get to that question from the perspective of media history, and then sort of let's try to link it to theater and performance history. Media historians are a weird bunch of people, and they sort of are prone to the idea of the evolution, technical evolution, I mean by that, and to the question of technology. So these are sort of, at least in the German-speaking discourse, and many of these protagonists sort of have been translated into English, have been very powerful to that extent. To focus on media as something that is technological mediated and is part of a larger historical development that usually, depending on when the scholars write, end with television or the computer or film. So this is a repetitive pattern of sort of falling for this kind of teleological historical construction. But the governing principle underlying this has been either the question of media as an element of mass communication, or of media as something that is technological, formed and technological dominated. So a scholar, for example, like Friedrich Kittler, a very prominent German scholar of media, even sort of went as far as to say that the history of media has to be written along the lines of technological development. And he developed all these ideas that the digital age is governed by a binary principle of 1 and 0, and this is truly what governs it. My counter-argument, and this kind of is also the bridgehead to the question of theater and performance history, is that most of you use a computer that has a desktop and a dustbin, and you're opening files. And you're not thinking in 1 and 0, but you're working sort of through these machines through an imaginary that is 19th, early 20th century stuff. This is how the offices looked. Some even had a window. Others only brought apples. So whatever you choose, but sort of it is this kind of, there is an imaginary that allows us to work this machine. This has shifted dramatically in the last 20 years, 25 years. But still, it is very evident that we are not working the computers on the level of the digital technology, at least the majority of us. So therefore, I would refuse the historical assumption or historiographic assumption of someone like Hitler as being essentialist at its core. And I think the same is true for the question of media being only everything that is mass communication and mass broadcasting. And equally, I would refuse an assumption like, for example, Schechner's assumption that performance basically runs on the idea of a ritualistic pattern of body and space and the idea of transformation. This is not to say that this doesn't exist in a cultural system, this doesn't exist in a cultural constellation, but I think it is not the pattern sort of that governs theater and performance history. So when Tracy Davis and myself thought about this question of how would we frame the historiographic approach we tried to project in this handbook, it was very important to us that it was rather the fact how the perception of the world is structured and organized through different media. They have a certain technological sort of foundation. You remember my beautiful triangle, right? I'm sure in the meantime you're in love with my diagrams. So this is the apparatus part of it. So it has a technological dimension. But the technological dimension is only one of various factors that plays into the cultural position of media and their efficiency or the effect they have on a society. To give you an example, ever since the 17th century, there was a very practical technique to create the effect of someone appearing as if it were an ethereal body. And it was a very simple structure. You would use sort of parts of the painted scenery. The scenery usually would be painted on linen, and you would sort of kind of have a certain part that you could lit from behind, and then it would become transparent. And someone standing behind would appear in a blurry fashion as if it was just a projection. Do you get it? I'm very bad at explaining technology. I mean, only worth when it comes to using it, but sort of, do you get what I mean? Can I get a little bit more of expression from you? I'm not expecting enthusiasm at that point, but sort of, thanks. So, and this transparent scenery is in hindsight looking as if it would emulate a cinematographic effect. But for sure it has nothing to do with projection, nothing. So in the Kittlerian sense, it would be something completely different. But if you think of my triangle, we have this phenomenon of aesthesis on top. So clearly there was a way for the audience, an ars spectandi, a way to look at it that would allow them to make sense. And this ars spectandi would rather be transferred at the beginning of the 20th century to the new medium of film. So whenever you read about these spectacular accounts that in 1895 the brothers Lumiere presented the first film, and it was a train coming into the station and the audience was so freaked out that they have thrown themselves under the table, rubbish. Not true. Cannot have been true. I'm sure the audience was curious, but no one can have been scared by this small flickering image that the camera Lumiere was able to project. So I would rather stress the fact that media are a specific constellation within societies, and usually sort of there are various at the same time that structure a specific perception of this society. And audiences learn a grammar on how to watch, how to attend a specific kind of media presentation. In that sense, I would argue that yes, of course, there's also the framing of ritual, where all the signs highlight the importance of co-presence in time and space, the reality of the performing body at that moment. But it would be, just one grammar among others that a society contains. And I think it's important that we remind ourselves of this ability, this literacy of people to switch between different grammars. Have I gotten to your point? Yes, of course.
No, I thought because it's something you might be also interested to. No, I'm just sort of wondering how would you, because the word media does kind of really, there is something about communication, certain things, or even technology, of course, mass communication or storage, which is one philosophical way of extending media. But I was just sort of wondering, I'm just bringing back Schechner because that's been a dominant model. So if we even go back to Schechner's original, play, game, sports, theatre, ritual, say for instance, as simple as that. Now, would you consider a sports match, for instance, as a mediatic, it is, television, there's a lot of other things that are partly, mediatized, one would say. But in your framework, would you actually see that, or a ritual, which has another kind of function, but not necessarily, or would you see that as a media passing certain information? Is that ambit? I'm just sort of wondering how will you?
Thank you. No, I think that would be, I think one really has to be cautious not to destroy a concept by applying it to each and everything, right? The other day there were some people playing cricket on the green, and I wouldn't describe this as a medium. But as soon as it sort of is meant for spectators to be perceived, it sort of shifts the meaning. And I think the same sort of holds true for rituals to a certain extent. So with rituals, it's always the question, are those who sort of are bystanders, are they part of the congregation? Are they sort of part of the ritual? Or are they conceived of as spectators? And this I think, sort of depends on the question how we sort of apply this concept to that. But I have to admit, it's a heuristic distinction. So it means, there's no sharp corners around it that would allow us to clearly say this is A or this is B. But I think there's a continuum into which this falls. And it partly sort of depends on our, on the questions we ask, and sort of also on our ability to explain certain phenomena through a certain approach. So especially with the question of sports and ritual, I think they have a tendency towards certain media representations, but they are not necessarily bound to that. What I find productive, I mean, this, you might remember that sentence, theater history is performs history. It's rather the provocation of not separating these other modes of representation from the theatrical or the performative spectrum. Because the examples we looked at sort of raised again and again the question, where would be the difference, where would be the distinctive line to theater and performance B at that specific point? Why would it fall to A and not to B? And it also would cut off theater from cultural development in the broader sense of the word. So especially in media history, and partly theater and performance history has done it to themselves, theater and performance were cut out from media history as something sort of that is something that is categorically different. But that meant sort of that theater and performance became something that always was in danger of being obsolete or being anachronistic. But I think it's important rather to tie it within this continuum, to see to what extent it responds also to the impulses it gets from that field, if that makes sense. More questions? There will be also time for questions tomorrow, so, but, yeah.
So my question is to Vishnupriya about your yesterday lecture on Brecht in India. Yeah. So you were discussing about that conjecture, about that Brechtian elements in Indian context. So definitely serve as a means of political intervention, whether the direct involvement in leftist theatre or Badal Sarkar shift from proscenium to people theatre, or Habib Tanvir use of folk elements to challenge that hegemonic narrative. But I was just curious to know that this institutionalization of these Brechtian methods in Indian theatre pedagogy of NSD or whatever else, and in that state sponsored, state owned that cultural bodies, do you think that this really serves as mean of political intervention or a political elaboration, rather than I think it's more a kind of formalistic tool rather than a radical act? So I think it diverted from that the original idea of that Brechtian method, that conjecture, how we deal with this thing.
Yeah, Vikram, that's a question, I've also been sort of thinking of. Conjuncture was the word used by Anuradha Kapoor. Not, she had sort of put it there that, this sort of post-independent, when the cultural institutions, cultural formations, the nation's culture are getting sort of formulated, there's a state of flux where, the exploration about the popular performances, folk, Naam, the humanism of the Bandung. She says those are the different forces, which are sort of coming together, which made it imperative for sort of a pedagogical process, which is more related to, say, a socialist sort of a country and its theatre. So otherwise they could have functioned with, Al-Qazi, who brought the Rada method. They had Sheila Bhatia, who's coming in from the IPTA. They had their own faculty. Why, this sudden connection with the German Democratic Republic, and why invite these people for such a long time? The politics is, of course, of a liberal democratic state, and a state which is sort of trying to, create certain sort of cultural, a cultural policy, a cultural sort of, a pedagogical sort of method which came. Now, just coming of these directors from the GDR or maybe the Soviet Union, does it automatically mean that it's going to become political? My argument, which I was trying to say, that maybe there's something in that method, acting on the, theatre making processes, which would later, when all these people are going out in the field, bring in a very different sort of politics. For the feminists, it was the materiality. Bring in the material on the stage, bring in the objects, so that this, sort of absorption with the individual can get sort of displaced on the object. And we know so many of the feminist directors do that because they don't want to create the feminist subject as a distorted mirror image of the masculine subject, right? So what do? They have objects to mediate with. And those are the people who had gone through this sort of process. That's why, what we were discussing about Nina Sam, it's not this individual man of Fritz Benowitz or Karl Weber. It is something more complex. It's a method, and that's why I brought it in through Al-Qazi, Ibrahim Al-Qazi, that which Al-Qazi knew he couldn't incorporate or he couldn't shape the, the actor training method in India in the sort of new drama school which has come into being, which is going to create these citizen artists, of course, sort of directed by the state. And I think it also came up yesterday, and these actors are not going to be the actors of Utpal Dutt's theatre or Nandikar or any of the real political theatres. They are going to perform a role as the citizen subjects of a new nation. They're no longer colonial subjects. Huh? But there's how do you deepen democratic processes? Al-Qazi was too ethical and too, a maverick and a dynamic person to be that, okay, the state says everybody should be subservient to the state, so I have to create actors who are subservient to the state. He himself didn't believe in it. That's why he did Tughlaq, right, which is really a critique of Nehruvian India. And he left NSD and the cultural institution when he really understood he couldn't do it. But what I'm saying is that it doesn't matter if it's Benowitz, it doesn't matter if it's Karl Weber. It is that method which he had, I think, understood by watching theatre in the socialist countries. He was very widely travelled. And also that was even Sheila Bhatia coming with, her experience of Punjabi folk, Kashmiri folk. She's not a theatre of the roots person, but coming through the IPTA and, this sort of thing. That they realized some sort of method beyond what they had, which is Stanislavski. He introduced the traditional Yakshagana and all, was sort of necessary to create a foundation for it. And the directors who were sort of going to go through this process, and when they go out of the NSD, they create a certain aesthetics which really was sort of challenging the sort of, hegemonic nation state. Theatre always had more diversity than, say, the classical dances had the liberty to do, or classical music had the liberty to do. So I think there is a sort of the political lies, what they did after they sort of left, be it the feminist theatre practices, be it, Suvarna going back to Nina Sam and his sort of. So, and the techniques they learned, this excesses, materiality, how that becomes an important mnemonics of talking about a society which, is failing to really distribute economic, cultural resources to everybody else. The biggest failure of Indian democracy has been the inability of a material distribution of wealth. And I think materialities or materialism which sort of they are bringing in within that pedagogical means later allowed that a different sort of aesthetics to come in. That's what I was sort of trying to argue.
Okay, thank you so much. Amita, hand over to you.
Okay. So if there are more questions, of course, we'll take them up tomorrow. Also, we have a kind of longish sessions, and also, of course, the round table. But now I will ask Dr. Indu Jain to give her kind of short presentation on feminist theatre and interventions in the larger question of these exchanges. And maybe just for the people in online, so we might kind of push the break a bit. So maybe we can take a break at 5 o'clock. Is it?
Or we take
Yeah.
a break in between.
between the paper, whatever is good.
Good for
Don't
you.
rush into that.
Yeah, so we can see either, maybe we think, yeah, I think so. So, yeah, Hindu. You can speak in it.
Okay.
This is okay, right? We'll just start in 5 minutes. How? This is forward and this is backward. Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Indu Jain, as Amit has graciously introduced me in the beginning. I wish to convey my profound appreciation to Professor Peter Marks and Dr. Amit Parmeswaran for curating this wonderful course. And before we start today's discussion, I must express my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Vishnupriya Dutt, who's not just my mentor and guide, but as Peter said, that one of the best pedagogy that a pedagogue could do is to formulate the question you really want to answer. And I think Pia ma'am made me always formulate the questions, and I think I'm here today answering some of them, which she made me question and think about in terms of Indian feminist theatre, pedagogy, and performance space. So as we had listened to Professor Dutt's conversation yesterday, and that how post-independence cultural and institutional landscape came about, and how inception of pivotal institutions like National School of Drama, arrival of Ibrahim Al-Qazi, and consequential interaction between Al-Qazi and Utpal Dutt and Brecht, and how Indian feminist directors, including Amal Alana and Anuradha Kapoor, Anamika Aksar, how they contested these entrenched patriarchal structures within institutional and pedagogical framework. So today I shall further expound upon these assertions and articulate that how these contemporary Indian feminist directors have engendered a significant schism, if we can call it, within these genealogies, thereby deconstructing the prevailing narratives that surround them. But before we go on, because I would just introduce something that one of the participants today questioned also, that what was happening in the post-colonial Indian state and the Indian National Theatre in terms of the kind of genealogies that were being created, and how these women directors were critiquing, overturning, challenging, and also rebuilding new genealogies for themselves. Now, similar to those number of post-colonial nations in the mid-20th century, post-independence Indian artists aimed to construct a new theatre. This was free from the legacy of colonialism and should reflect key aspects of this whole idea of new national identity. And in doing so, they followed modernity's project of an amalgamation, I must say, of tradition and folk forms. Also, together with the sensibilities of the modern, they were inspired by the West, but they were also experimenting with local creative idioms, right? So this is just one quote by Partha Chatterjee, who talks about that how these institutional spaces were coming up, how they were concentrated around the capital, Delhi. And Delhi had a unique space at that time because it had not experienced a regional or colonial theatre culture like a city like Calcutta before. So as a result, first directors, they deliberately engaged in a pedagogical process to create this new generation of citizen artists, the conversation that just happened right now, who will play an active role in this civil society. So an active theatrical public sphere would be an important democratic institution where these ideal citizen actors or artists would reflect the vision of this benevolent state. Now, an example of this theatre, of course, one of the directors is Ibrahim Al-Qazi. He worked in Bombay. He was invited to National School of Drama. He was asked to create guidelines for a fully fledged curriculum for the new drama school, and he remained there till 1977. Now, Al-Qazi's productions definitely became spectacular theatrical events because in the new post-independence modern theatre of Delhi, the kind of characters, the kind of actors that he produced were not seen before. So he created these star male actors, and they were carefully nurtured and taught in the drama school, and they were taught to be these larger than life individuals on stage, right? So creating this Indian drama repertoire. These two productions have been extensively discussed, so I won't go into the details of them, but just two photographs for all of you to see that how they were, the performance space was, both of them are two pre-colonial edifices that are located at the center of the capital, right? Purana Kila and Firozshah Kotla. Now, these performances became key point of reference and inauguration of, which Partha Chatterjee also talks about, this whole idea of post-colonial modern Indian theatre, right? Now, this delineation of creation of larger than life characters, and here is what I want to talk more about, is that the pedagogical lexicon employed by the women directors who came into this national institutional space of NST in Delhi, especially from 1988 onwards, when so Anamika Haksar, Anuradha Kapoor, Maya Rao, Kirti Jain, some of the key figures who were the key partakers in formulating a new syllabus that was based on a more principles of their feminist interventions, and how we will just come to that in a bit. But it was Kirti Jain, and under her leadership, she enabled and created a certain kind of space for these women directors to start thinking about a new kind of experimentation with the whole idea of the body, the whole idea of how to devise a new syllabus. For example, Anuradha Kapoor decided that, you know, Hindi would no longer be the only medium in which students could come to the institution and audition for admission. So she made it much more egalitarian and making it much more heteroglossic in terms of use of language. In fact, audition centers were opened in more cities than in Delhi. The male-female ratio also changed. So there were more female students started being admitted to create a certain kind of parity. So what one is talking about is that there was a distinctively gendered sensibility that these women directors were able to bring in. Now, Kapoor says that assigned positions in history, sanctioned genealogies, and official narratives manufacture habits of seeing. She says that she argues that these habits can be acted upon. And this is what is extremely important, right? So what they started saying was that how do we look at these already created genealogies, because they had conditioned people to see theatre in a particular way. A particular kind of habits of seeing had been formulated, right? So she says they can be addressed, reshaped, challenged by alternative configuration of practice, which is collaborative, which is what these women emphasized upon in the process of staging and creating democratic theatre space. So she maps out in many of her writings that how these women changed the aesthetics of performance through a lot of these things, right? Innovative use of the female body on stage, new dramatic structures that stressed on cooperative working processes. They created circular, non-linear plots and narratives. Dialogic communication was challenged and undone. Gender norms were destabilized and gender hierarchies were disturbed. Now, here I want to talk today about this one particular director, Anamika Haksar, and it is she who I would further elaborate upon, and case studies that I'm going to pick up are going to be more from her oeuvre and her theatre spaces. But the question that perhaps we should also think about and could think about is that what does interculturalism would mean in the Indian context when we talk about cultures within a country, right? In the sense that when we use terms like, say, unity in diversity, or we use something like multiculturalism. So are the hierarchies of dominant group really being challenged when we talk about these, right? And why I'm saying that is that I'll share an interesting anecdote with all of you, which is that in one of the conferences in Ghana, we had these performers, the feminist performers, who were part of an ensemble there, who came to talk to the group and speakers, and we were very radically trying to discuss intersectionality, and we were trying to discuss feminist intersections. And we looked at their faces, and one of them said, yeah, it works. And we were very curious to know, what does she mean? And she said, look, whenever we have to apply for a grant, that's when we use the word intersectionality. She says it's become the in word for allowing a certain kind of visibility, but what is it doing for us is something that needs to be questioned. And that made the entire group rethink the conversations that we were having. And it made me think that perhaps what these women directors were doing was to create a different kind of interculturalism. And that is what I would like to elaborate upon in these particular examples that I'm going to pick up. Because interculturalism is also happening in the Indian context at the subterranean level. If you think about it, so historians like Sanjay Subramaniam will talk about connected histories. People like Carlo Ginsberg will talk about micro histories. So perhaps there is a need to look at these archives, spanning regions, subjects, together in a particular way to understand what is happening, right? Okay. So these socially conscious women theatre directors who were reclaiming a multi-perspectival discourse on new performance ecology here, they were focusing on different kind of process and pedagogy in their work. Now the key to their interventionist work lies, of course, in their feminist sensibilities, but also in espousal of exploring different models of collaborations, right? Different models of intertextualities or intersectional feminist lens. Because we all know that even intersectionality is not a complete way of saying that all kind of hierarchies have been dealt with. We have read Nivedita Menon and others so eloquently talk about it, that we need to question this kind of intersectionality too. So what people like Kapoor, what people like Haksar were also trying to do was to animate the idea of horizontal networks, almost like power lines, as well as affective and critical solidarities Thus, they were able to challenge the sanctioned genealogies. Now, let me just go to Anamika. So, Anamika, she did her undergrad from Delhi University. Then she studied at National School of Drama and studied theatre there. She studied with Alkazi and Karant, who she talks about a lot in her process. She went on to study for 6 years, that is 82 to 88, at the Soviet Institute of Theatre Arts in Moscow. She came back, she joined as a faculty at the National School of Drama for a couple of years from 1990 onwards. She was one of the key partakers in formulating a new syllabus, and after a couple of years, she made this radical move to decide to leave the institutional space of National School of Drama, and she moved to Bombay. Now, talking about her training in the Soviet Union, Haksar, she built on her Stanislavskian training, okay? She prioritizing the actor's exploration of interiority over externalization of characters, you know. So in her method, there was a sharp shift in actor training methods. The actor training methods that yesterday was spoken about in terms of, say, Alkazian method, you know, the whole idea of director as all authorial and the single authorial head. So she aimed to create what one can call as performance-based text. But a performance-based text does not mean looking at the end production as the main goal. Rather, what she focused upon was long improvisation process. Like, for example, in some of her rehearsals, so she would not assign a character or a role to one particular actor and say, okay, fine, throughout the rehearsal, just learn the part, get into the part, just become that character. That's not her. In fact, many times during rehearsal, suppose one person is enacting a particular character, the next day she would make them switch roles. That next day you're no longer rehearsing for that character, you're going to rehearse for another character. So that totally changed the dynamics of the process itself. In fact, in some of her productions, if you look at sequentially some productions and reviews like Raj Darpan, which she did later with the students of National School of Drama, what she also did was that during, so the actors were explained what they have to do in terms of how they feel about themselves, and on stage she did not create a perfect blocking for them. She would allow them to explore. So in that particular play, the props or the objects on stage had different positionalities in different performances, you know, the same play being performed on different days, but the positionality and the blocking of the objects would not be same. She allowed her actors to create that space on their own, not just in the rehearsal spaces, but also in the end production. So for this, the methodological tool that she used was workshops. So she worked on workshop with students to collectively devise a production. So there was abundant use of the body, there was consciousness raising, there was innovative use of space. And her training in the erstwhile USSR was seen as progressive interpretation, not just in terms of its socialist dramaturgy and the vision that it promoted of the collective expression through dramaturgy's aesthetic idioms, right? So her intervention is that how she focused strongly on the idea of knowing yourself. Okay. She talks about her time in Moscow, and she says that how in 5 years they had 5 theatre practitioners who took them from year 1 to year 5. And if you look at in details the new syllabus that these women directed, a lot of it was inputs from Anamika, and she built from her experience in Moscow to bring about these new changes. Now let me briefly talk about this one particular production, which is Reminiscence of Krishna. Now this is one of her most earlier production. It was done when she was in the final year in the USSR, and it traveled in different cities in India after that. And it's a very, very, it was a part of, it was part of the Indo-USSR festival, and it was performed in India in 1989. She devised it with actors from her drama school in Russia, and then of course she had some of her own people join in when she came back to India. So it is interesting, but it's also paradoxical that after receiving 5 years of training in psychological drama, right, what she did in the Russian Institute of Theatre Arts, she picks up a mythological theme with an ensemble which expressed itself totally in movement. So they were like almost there were no dialogues. It was just movement, gestures, body. So she's drawing heavily from Indian iconography and brings into her performance space anecdotes about life of Krishna as laid out in the epic text Mahabharata. The plot was not linear, of course, but primarily it kind of centered around portrayal of Krishna's Dharam Sankat in siding with the Pandavas in Kurukshetra. But, you know, unlike the highly stylized, verbose, established representations of the stories of the epic text Mahabharata, like recently I saw this play by this male theatre director Eklavya. I don't know if some of you have seen it at the National School of Drama, and he picked up the story of Eklavya, but it was heavily logocentric, it was absolutely verbose. But what she does at that time in 1989 is that the story of Krishna from birth to his association with the cowherds, with gopis, Kansa's assassination episode with Putna, Kalia the snake. So she brings all of those in, and she has these actors from the Soviet Union in leotards and scarves performing all these scenes just through actions, occupying spaces, trying to convey the mental turmoil that Krishna undergoes till the end, not being sure what to choose, right or wrong. And in fact, towards the end, there is this huge muslin cloth that is hanging above on the stage, and it suddenly descends on all the actors on stage, trying to talk about that how Kalyug is the answer in like aftermath of Krishna's death. As you can see, her actors were definitely not dressed in finery that is associated with Indian costume drama. In fact, they were like sylph-like performers with leotard, as I say. So there was no fixed structure to the set, but there was a fluid movement of body, cloth, and all of this created a certain kind of immersive spectatorial experience. And this is Anamika in '89, when she had not even started teaching at the National School of Drama. Once she joined the drama school, she did this production called Antaryatra in 1993. Now this again, the theme or the context that she chooses is from an epic Chilapatikaram, which is attributed to the Jain poet Ilango Adikal. And she chooses these grand texts which are usually taught even till today in courses for English literature or otherwise in terms of the text, the language, the word. But throughout the performance, she tries to undo that logic through body movement, through the physical, through creating metaphorical landscape in space. So what we have is, I'll come back to this. Yeah. So what we have is, this is a story of Kanagi, Kovalan and Madhavi, for those who do not know the story of Chilapatikaram. So Kanagi and Kovalam are married to each other, and Kovalan falls in love with the Koti son, Madhavi, and but he realizes his mistakes, goes back to his wife, but is mistakenly killed by the king. Now in her fury, Kanagi gets so angry with the king that she descends and is deified and worshipped as a Devi. You must have read in Andal's poetry also what happens in a similar way. So Anamika, for this particular production, in her process, made her students read all of that, but not just that. She made them travel to South India in order to interact with the people, to ask about the epics and a popular understanding of this particular text. What do they feel? So, you know, she draws from alternative mode of representation, and this grandiloquent, traditional, lofty texts are totally reconfigured in her performance space. Now, as you can see, there is a mirror towards that side. There was another mirror that was placed here. It's not there in this photograph, but she would have two mirrors placed in such a way that Madhavi and Kanagi would often stand like it crossed across these two mirrors. So you would see somebody who's standing here, reflected on this mirror and somebody standing here reflected on this mirror, nevertheless, they're also in front of a mirror. So from an audience perspective of point of view, the gaze becomes that perhaps this person is who's this person's reflection. So how the two were becoming the mirror image of each other. So she was not positing the two women as the virtuous chaste wife and the evil courtesan as two different figures and creating this narrative. Rather, her actors, both these women, were becoming mirror images of each other, and how she does it with objects on stage, how she does it with the space on stage is what makes it extremely interesting. So there were many other women who were etching out column on the floor with the white chalk powder. There were other people there on the stage at different levels in this particular performance. And what happens is that many times the main protagonists, which were these two women, they would create a figurative choreographic presence by getting interchanged by a number of these other women who are just etching column patterns. So for an audience to say, okay, who's the primary protagonist or a subject, she would kind of make you think about it. She would kind of make you think about it through gestures and through body language. Now another production that I want to talk about is Uchapka. Now the whole point of interculturalism that we were talking about before in terms of connected histories become much more poignant here when we come to this particular production. Because what Anamika is doing is, she's dealing with the issue of caste here. So this particular play was based on Lakshman Gaikwad's book, Uchalya, which is about this criminal tribe that lives on the fringes of the society, and their trials and tribulations find visibility in this particular play. Now this is a wandering tribe which by profession from ages basically steal, so they are thieves, right? But individuals from these tribes, they don't have a sense of belonging because they're also migrating from one place to another, and by the virtue of their caste and regressive history, they are seen as outlying habitants, delinquents, and a threat to the normative, or as Sara Ahmed would call as stranger danger. So how does Haksa brings this figure of the stranger danger onto her theatre space? And please remember that this play was also done by students of National School of Drama who were coming from different cultural background with different linguistic skills, different caste brackets, different class brackets. So to enable a kind of a process during her rehearsals where all these students would understand the kind of space that she was creating, the dialogue that she was creating can be understood in a true kind of interculturalism that she was generating through her feminist practice and feminist intervention, right? It's the kind of connected history that she's talking about. So a migrant figure's fears, anxieties, habitat, survival, livelihood, through the abject body present on stage, the narrative then kind of travels into the middle class civil society who has come to watch this play. Though the play was adapted from a Marathi, which is an Indian regional language, the language of the play was primarily Hindi. But Haksa did not observe this particular standard as a standardized medium for the entire play. So what happens is that often in the play, the actors would break into different languages, especially Marathi, to have these long monologues without any explanation or subtitles or a certain kind of Hindi elucidation. Now here if you see, that's the blade. So she, the way she would play with objects, many times the objects and actor's body also become interchangeable in the play. She would bring that focus on the center stage on the object. So there's this huge blade placed in the center where these body movements of these people at the fringes of the society, because they were made to hide this blade as part of their profession deep into their mouth in order to escape police atrocities or interrogation. They would of course undergo a lot of lacerations in their mouths when they would put this blade. But but that's their livelihood. So the play also starts with them worshipping the blade and talking about it as their means in their livelihood. Also, the whole idea of performativity of disgust, right? She would show them their eating habits, sitting on the floor, how would they do it, and I would like to show you another one. Yeah, and she would show that the upper caste people would be sitting on a table enjoying a sumptuous meal, and an actor who is positioning herself as a Dalit migrant body would sit below and narrate this long monologue in Marathi. She also brings in elements of black and subversive humor here. And if you look at the arrangement of actors, there is a kind of a gestural hierarchy, like a pyramid that she often draws in terms of bodies on stage, which becomes very interesting to see this kind of embodied pyramid that she does. This is something that she did at Kochi Biennale. It's called Composition on Water. Why I'm bringing the two together is because this is also something that deals with similar topic and similar context for Haksar, which is of course very close to her, which is adaptation of Namdev Dhasal's poetry. Now, Dhasal is also a Marathi poet, writer and a Dalit activist from Maharashtra. So she would bring the pain, the anger, the ancestral and present humiliation that the Dalit body faces in this particular performance piece through the metaphor of water. Now, in this performance, there were two water sources. One side, there was this fresh water cascading waterfall, but on the other, there would be a drain of stinking water. And she would show that how even something as basic as the right of water was denied to them. Now, one of the things that she did was that some of her actors, and she talks about it, is refused to play certain parts because they felt that they could not position themselves in this particular positionality of, say, a Dalit body or some of the other. So she tried to exchange or also be fluid about their caste positions in terms of these actors presenting themselves on stage. So this whole experience of thirst, she will talk about that, how she took a little bit of water in a cap, like a bottle cap, and she said that's the only water you will get for a couple of hours to see and understand what thirst is. Now try and put it. And she says that, do you feel your body shrinking? So these shrinking bodies was something that she tries to show on stage, and the speaking language or the speaking dialogues, whatever was being spoken, became different from the performing body. So, you know, she was able to bring the two together in her performance space. Bodies cringing with thirst, wretched with years of subjugation, you know, frantically digging in the mud for water. So it created a very strong visual for audience. And since this was at a Biennale, as you can see the audience standing here, they would be performing this in a certain kind of circular sequence. So people could just watch even for 2 minutes and just walk out and come back again after some time. So that kind of structure of proscenium, to say that you sit and watch an ephemeral performance because it's ephemeral, it will end, it will go, was something that also she challenged in this particular kind of performance space, right? So when we talk about interculturalism here, should we not then focus on her pedagogy to say that, okay, what is the process that she is enabling for her students who come from different cultural background to create a space where these cultures can come together? So it's not just about collaborations of a dominant culture with a not dominant culture and then creating a certain cultural exchange, but it was more about the connections that she was able to draw out, right? So in both these performances, which is Uchakka and Composition on Water, actors belonging to different cultures and linguistic backgrounds, you know, it is unmistakably that an intercultural training of this kind was possible for her because she was actively engaging with a large student body at the National School of Drama. So her pedagogy or her positionality as a pedagogue also enabled her to do this kind of experimentation, enabled her to create this kind of processes. In this particular play, what she also did was that as research, as her process, she actually contacted real pickpockets and made her students undergo a workshop with them and taught them things like, okay, stealth movement. How do you pick a pocket? She said, one of her interviews, it was very interesting, and she said that often I would converse with this young boy who would talk to me about his life, etc., who was a pickpocket, and every time by the end of the day, her wallet was gone. So, she would say that, how was it happening? I mean, he would come and give it back to her. But, she would say that I'm trying to read your body, I'm trying to study her body and, his body. And she would ask her actors to do the same. But how successful were they? These are the questions she actually asks in her interview. But at least she creates that space of that kind of exchange, in her process, in her work, in her pedagogy, creates this new kind of language. Now, though her idiosyncratic methods, some of them were not very happy with these methods, and I think this was one of the reasons that she decided to leave the institutional space, because she found it constricting to do the kind of experimentation that she was doing, but she made them deeply aware of this diversity for them to comprehend a unique understanding, especially the concept of space. So, how space itself is peopled, how space is demarcated, or how space is proscribed for people belonging to a particular community or tribe or section of the society. That understanding was something that she worked on in her pedagogy, in her process. And she also talks about it, that this understanding, when you do an end production with, say, a month of rehearsal, she says it's difficult to get. But when she was working with this student body, even in her classroom spaces, day in and day out, she could make it like a cauldron of different cultures, different exchanges at many layers. That's also not something that is done linearly. So her focus definitely was on relational encounters and how, it can lead the body in this context to shrink, how it can react to haptic sensations, especially when the performer is trying to create a theatrical efficacy that often extends to life, something that they can all relate to, talk about, see all around, right? Do we want to break, Peter? No. We can continue? Okay. So a final example that I want to talk about now is this wonderful movie. Many of you might have seen it. If not, it's available on Apple TV. Please watch it. And because she struggled really a lot to get a cinema release for this movie, couldn't happen in a large-scale commercial way. We all know why. But this was a project that Professor Peter Marks and I discussed, and I'm grateful to him for his insights and discussions on the same. And at length, I spoke about it to Pia ma'am while I was doing my PhD, so those inputs were also factored in. But I offered to initiate a conversation around social dimensions of dream and dreamlike imaginations within the framework of staging of dreams by Haksar in this production. Now let me briefly tell you that this is like a documentary type of movie. It's not really like a feature film, nor can you call it a documentary. So it's something in between, and these are just two posters from the movie. Taking the horse to eat jalebi, she calls it घोड़े को जलेबी खिलाने ले जा रहा हूँ, right? And it is based in Old Delhi, Shahjahanabad. And the anecdote goes that when one asked her that why did she keep this particular title, what was the significance of this name? She said, one, we all know that Old Delhi, heart of Mughlai kitchen, is famous for jalebis and other sumptuous items. But she said that, there is something that stayed with her. She used to stay in Old Delhi. In fact, even today, there is this torn down building which is called as Haksar Bhavan, still there. And she said that many times she would see a person taking the horse, from the streets and would call out and say, Bhaiya, where are you going? And as a rebuke, the person would turn around and say, हाँ जलेबी खिलाने ले जा रहा हूँ. It's like kind of dismiss her in that particular way. She said that kind of stayed with me, and it also told me something very specific to these inhabitants of this new kind of cosmos that Old Delhi inhabits, right? So, so in this, there is no fixed storyline per se in the movie, but the narrative moves from moment to movement, and the structure of the film also mirrors the winding streets and gullies and kuchas of old Delhi, and she narrates these lives of homeless people, basically also migrants who have moved from rural spaces to urban spaces in need for employment and livelihood. And but what will happen next is something that they don't know in terms of the possibility of a grand future. But there is this element of dreams that is very integral to this particular movie. These people dream. So when we talk about, say, people on the fringes of the society, right? Often there is this patronizing gaze of an observer talking about them. But what you see in this particular movie is that she does not do so. I mean, can I just play that video if possible? This is just a trailer for those who haven't seen the movie.
करते थे उसी में मर गए अब बहुत डर लगता है से देखते हैं
जनाब लोग कहते हैं कि दिल्ली उनकी जेब में रहती है और यहाँ तो हजारों जेबें तलाश करते हैं दिल्ली तो कहीं नहीं मिली
नमाजें निकल रहे हैं मैं उनकी जेब काट रहा हूँ इतने में बारिश आ गई मैंने जेब काटना बंद करके भीख मांग
चोरी की सारे हम चोरी करते भाई मेरे दिमाग में आइडिया क्यों ना आकाश जैन की तरह हम भी दिल्ली की वॉक कराएं अपनी दिल्ली की वॉक किसी सेवा को भी
एक स्कूल है जवान लड़कियां हैं उनकी माँ उसको बहुत सारे पकवान दे रही
मुझे काम से निकालती है
सोल कर बैठना उसने देखने वालों तमाशा खुद न बन जाना तमाशा देखने वालों
देखो निगाह नाज से दिल्ली के नजारे तहजीब की जन्नत है जमुना के किनारे
खुद न बन जाना तमाशा देखने वालों
Yeah. So you all saw this brief 3-minute snippets of the movie. Now, when one is considering the Indian performance space, can dreams on stage or equal states of consciousness be reduced to a psychological dream? Can a simple mapping of the same within the exemplar of Freudian psychoanalysis and unconscious with respect to dream interpretation Won't it be reductive and counterproductive, especially in the Indian context? So what needs to be elaborated upon is how, in this movie, Haksar shows dreams as social imaginations. These dreams are shared, they are distributed and discussed through, in a kind of a theatrical representation, because Haksar, being a veteran theatre director, brings her skill set of a theatre director into this movie in terms of actor's body and the kind of sequences that she employs here. The idea is to understand the social reality within personal experiences, and she puts also all of these in broader social and historical context. So the cultural valence given to dreams in this production need to be contextualized within the specificities of varied contexts, like what is the regional milieu, what is the theatrical language, what is the political imagination, etc. Right? This we have seen. Yeah. Now Delhi, as we all know it witnesses migration of unskilled and semi-skilled rural population, basically looking to improve their socio-economic status every year. It happens every year, right? Large portions of these individuals, they are forced to settle in extreme unhygienic clusters and are denied any basic rights. So it is the lives of these have-nots that becomes the canvas of this particular work, Ghode Ko Jalebi Khilane Le Ja Raha Hoon, where she weaves in many layers into her film to talk about the social dimension of dream. So on one hand, she will bring in literature, folk art form, as you must have seen a little bit from the trailer. There is animation, there is storytelling, there is almost Marquesian magic realism, there are visual effects. So the lives, the aspirations, the dreams of these inhabitants of old Delhi, and what the production becomes is almost like an ode. It becomes an ode to the culture of Shahjahanabad. But let me remind you again that the gaze is not that of a patronizing observer. Now, in the past, when we understand the space of Shahjahanabad, it was not only the capital of the Mughal Empire, but it was also at the center of culture, right? Art, poetry, music, artisanship, everything flourished here. But when we look at present day Old Delhi or Shahjahanabad, what we see is chaos. It's literally bursting at seams with people. It is common to see dilapidated buildings, traffic jams, unauthorized construction. But what this movie or her work draws attention is that how this part of Delhi has been post-independence. So there is, what she focuses upon is that there is a very different kind of sustainable cosmos that needs to be understood here. So at present, the romance of the bazaars of Delhi can be experienced. We've all been to Chandni Chowk, right? The Kucha Gullies, the biggest wholesale market of silver, of glasses, wedding trousseaux, spices, all of this are there, and whenever we go there, the narrow winding lanes and gullies are quite inviting that way, because it was also the heart of Mughlai kitchen, right? So soft naans, one can think of kebabs whenever one think of Purani Delhi, rabdi, shahi tukda, all this come to our mind. But this densely populated space, it has a kind of a sustainable internal economy that enables a certain kind of internal migration from many parts of the country. And the intermingled mix of communities living here for generations, almost like a cauldron of intercultural mix, that makes it an example of secularism and a kind of cosmopolitanism also that needs to be understood in this particular movie that she brings forth. So it is this resilience, this hope of seeing the inhabitants of the city in a new light that becomes the center of Haksar's narrative. Now, you must have seen that in the beginning, in the trailer, that there is this goddess Lakshmi animated. She comes center stage, and suddenly a red flag comes and pokes her, on one side of the cheek, and she's a little irritated. And the scene then suddenly changes to two of these central characters. There are four primary central characters. Two of them start fighting with each other that after a very long time and after a very hard day's work, I was finally asleep, and you came into my dreams and interrupted my sleep. And the other one says, well, I didn't come into your dream, you came into my dream and disrupted it. So this idea of shared dreams between these inhabitants is something that really makes us wonder what is happening here. And then the scene changes to this, that when one of the characters, Lal Bihari, he's raising this giant communist flag in his dream, and he's thinking of, the anthem is playing in the background, and he's thinking of liberation, he's thinking of freedom. So what is she trying to do with these bodies in this performance space becomes a larger question in this particular movie. And how is she dealing with this whole idea of dreams? Definitely not in the Freudian sense of psychoanalysis, because that's not what she means when she's talking about these shared dreams, right? So how is she archiving their dreams and also their memories, almost making it a memoir and a different kind of archiving into a performative space of this documentary movie, right? Now, what we see is that the performative body of not just these 4 actors, but others also, they kind of become a repertoire of movement, of gestures, of tactile practices, and which is something much more true of the migrant experiences, right? Okay. These are some of the other themes that you will see in the movie that come across. So it's not just about migrant laborers and their life, but many times the cinematic frames are overlapped with each other in such a way that one sees figures like snakes, holy cow. In the trailer, you just saw these white corpses hanging mid-air. So they would interlap and come, perhaps also symptomatic or emblematic of the kind of dreams that these people are imagining, which is trying to picturize from these kind of framing here, right? So it is now, as we have talked about in her other production, that where do we see this kind of interculturalism that one talks about, or creating interventionist spaces that we have spoken about? Then one talks about her process again. So she researched for more than 7 years, and her team, her 4 actors, worked actually with some of the migrant laborers in Shahjahanabad, beggars, pickpockets, rag pickers, and each dream sequence, in fact, each fragment of dream that is present in this particular movie are anecdotes from the real dreams of these people. So these are not something that she's imagined to create a particular narrative, but she's drawing from the data that she has collected through years of groundwork and research, right? And as we saw in the trailer, what she does is she juxtaposes 2 kind of very interesting walks in this movie. Now many of us must have gone for some historical walk or the other, right? They are in Delhi, they keep happening, where they take you and make you familiar with the city's history. So, city as a cauldron of art, culture, that's how these walks would be projected, right? You would see historical landmark, traditional food, everything will be wrapped up almost in an exotic packing of subaltern history. That's how conventional historical walks take place. Now, the city tours urbanism, and this is for consumption of all the tourists who come or individuals who take up this kind of city walks, right? So Haksar wants to puncture this particular kind of narrative, and what she does is she creates a parallel walk. So this is one actor who is Lokesh Jain. He becomes he is presented as a Urdu Persian aficionado, and you saw in the trailer that he was reciting poetry, but then he is traveling through the gullies, as you can see, and then what happens is that you see throughout the movie there will be excerpts from Ghalib, from Dag, from Mir, and what he does is he takes the urban middle class elite and especially the overseas tourist almost on a magic carpet. So in the movie you would also see a magic carpet flying across the city, and the stinking drains, the corpses, the polluted water, everything is something that he would easily ignore and not talk about, almost like a cover-up. And then What the director, however, wants to focus on, and that you see through camera work and her frames, is Old Delhi's underbelly, right? So she would show footpath populated with homeless bodies, how they are working in inhumane condition, everything, and you know, the memories, the dreams of these people. And here she brings in her next character, Patru, who's played by Ravindra Sahu. Now, unique to her process is that how even in this particular movie, she allows each of these actors to work and develop their own individual style. So there is no grand directorial style that is present in the movie, and she brings together various affectations from the spectators. Like Sahu is a well-known Delhi National School of Drama trained actor who's also trained in this whole idea of psychological interior acting, and there are these long scenes when, you know, he'll stand and he's actually mourning the loss of his lover, and he's thinking about, oh, I dream, I wish I could become a musician. And so these are these long sequences of this homeless Patru, because he is not able to carve out the niche in life that he wants to create. And then he looks at this other guy, Lokesh Jain, and he sees him lying to the tourists all the time, talking about how beautiful old Delhi is and how Mughals used to come here and this used to happen. And he says to his friends, why don't we take these tourists on an alternate walk? Let us show them the real Delhi, or let us show them a Delhi as we understand old Delhi. And what happens then is that tourists had signed up for these tourist walks. Why? Because they want to see the glorious past. They don't want to see the ugliness or Seva Kutir vans picking up people, right? And he would use language like, oh, these people are uthawing, and then they are, you know, phekoing them outside in some jungles of Bhavana, you know. So he would talk about all of this because this is the walk he shows them. He shows the underbelly of Delhi to this tourist. In fact, one of the stories he tells one of the tourists is that how this one particular vendor was extremely beaten up by a landlord and a money lender because he couldn't pay back the money that he had borrowed. And the girl suddenly turns around and said, listen, this is not the story I want. You know, what are you trying to show us? This is not the story that I have signed for, right? So and the amazing bit about the movie and her process is that all of this in terms of content also comes across often to us in the movement and the body of these four actors. Now each of them have their own space. Like for example, now Gopalan is a renowned theatre artist from Kerala, right? His strengths are yoga, kalari. These are his main strengths. So when this actor is made to perform a laborer's job, there are these long scenes that focus only on his body. You know, he's trying to pull a very heavy weight, and there is almost a 6-minute sequence with ambient sound. So you don't have any dubbing or anything, and all you can see is sweat coming out of his body and this weight is being pulled. But his skills in yoga, his skills in kalari, which he brings out into this body of the laborer, is something that becomes the showcase, is something that how he visualizes that character, which Haksar creates this space for and allows Gopalan to experiment with. So those whole non-conformist body language and expressions that she's able to bring to the spectators is definitely part of her feminist intervention and also exploration of different cultures, right? So another question that I think I would just wind up quickly with it is that how does performance instantiate engaging bodies, texts, sounds and action to conjure new ways of being and becoming? How do we make feminist critical arguments via close readings of performances and gestures? Now here I would like to quote from Jose Esteban Munoz, who talks about, so how does one stage utopia, if that's what we are talking about, which is to say, how do we enact utopia? He says that one thing I have learned from this question is that utopia is an ideal, something that should mobilize us, push us forward. Utopia is not prescriptive, it renders potential blueprints of a world not quite here, a horizon of possibilities, you know, the kind of possibilities that Huxer is creating in her process, not a fixed schema. It is a productive, to think about utopia as flux, a temporal disorganization as a moment when the here and now is transcended by the then and there that would be and indeed should be. He goes on to say that performance is a kernel of potentiality, and I think that is absolutely true in the case of Huxer, and especially the movie Ghode Ko Jalebi Khilane Le Ja Raha Hoon, that it transmitted to audience and witnesses, and that the real force of performance is its ability to generate a modality of knowing and recognition among audiences and groups that facilitates modes of belonging, especially minoritarian belonging. If we consider performance under such a lens, we can see the temporality of what I describe as a utopian performativity, which is to say a manifestation of a doing that is in the horizon, a mode of possibility. Thank you.
We have 10 minutes, and then also if there are more questions, we'll take a break and come back and then.
Or do you want to take a break? Because I think everybody is tired.
So we'll do quick questions, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
I can pick one or two and then we can take, otherwise it will get withdrawn.
Thank you. It's always delightful to listen to you speaking about Anamika, because you really brought her back into purview of research and work. I was just thinking, because you started with that interculturalism can also mean sort of people representing different backgrounds and different regions and different cultures coming together. And inherent in your argument was also that the people are coming together. They also are not representing one identity, right? They have a particular class, particular gender, particular religion. And, that's how sort of when they are collaborating, these sort of, the interaction between them, at one point it can be, something based on gender. Then it can change based on, say, class versus even caste, when the thing comes of water, what is she showing? Because trained in the Soviet Union, the category was always class, but this is such an important caste category. So, and then comes a question which I think Rustam raised in one of his, the thing that taking from Spivak, that who is speaking for whom, that even a person who's in the drama school or comes into these theatre companies, are they really empowered to speak about those marginalized to such an extent that they don't even have access to water? And then I think the mediation from Lakshman Gaikwad, then how she's sort of negotiating, I thought that was very important. And in Ghode Ki Jalebi, it's not only the four actors, right? Because what you were showing and mentioning, she uses a lot of the local people. And yeah, I think it was in your work or, her interview where she was saying that some of them she had worked with in 1985 when she was, doing the agitprop in Gaon Se Shahar Tak, and how she kept in touch with these workers of this aluminium steel factory, and many of them since have been sort of thrown out of the, as the workforce. They've been made redundant, and she brings them back. So there's again a sort of very interesting, interaction on screen and on stage between real people who come from those marginalized sections and the trained urban actors. I was just wondering, it sounds very idealistic and utopic, but where and what are the tensions really, the anxiety that, we are appropriating voices? When, I know this is a question, if I don't ask, Akash will ask.
Thank you for the question. In fact, this is a question that in one of my interviews I did ask Anamika, and she says that one of the reasons she left National School of Drama was also that the space was not allowing her to practice this research process where she can be more inclusive in terms of expanding, is the word she used, her student constituency or her actors per se. And one cannot deny the fact that a person like Anamika is cultural capital. She's daughter of P.N. Huxer. We all know that she was privileged, and at that time to go to USSR and study for 6, 7, 8 years was definitely a privilege. So her positionality of privilege is definitely there, and she has also worked, when she worked at National School of Drama, it was a state-sponsored enterprise. So withstanding that particular space, but what is interesting is that her vulnerability in that space is something that she was open to experimenting with and also talking about. Like in Kasauli, they did this workshop which Anuradha organized, and Anamika and others were also part of it. But later when Anamika talks about it, she said that it made her even think more about privilege per se, because in that workshop, most of the participants were all cultural capital, academics, intelligentsia. And she said that I realized that at that time, it was a very enlightening experience because she was very young. But as she started teaching in the National School of Drama, interacting with these people through her theatre group, started working with, because she also talked about the Beggars Act, that how most of the beggars now under Government of India, all the performers come under that, so their livelihood is lost. So she did an extensive survey and interacted with all of them. She felt that the kind of space she needs to create, even in her process, she couldn't find that at the drama school, because the drama school was so end production oriented, a particular kind of syllabus and end product oriented, that she didn't want it to stay in that space longer. And I think that definitely the whole idea of exposing her vulnerability and also accepting how she's part of that cultural capital is something that she does. And what I liked and what I think that the way she has somehow been able to at least navigate this space, how successful is she in doing that is still questionable, because not all individuals will even participate in her exercise with the same rigor, right? So I think the key is that the kind of feminist sensibility that she brings in different models of collaboration. Like for this movie, she picked up these factory workers who she had already worked with, and she makes these associations. Like this movie was also screened in Chandni Chowk on a big screen for everybody, like more than 150 people who are part of the movie were invited to come and watch. So she organized that screening for them and also took a feedback to what is that they are thinking about. In fact, even today I see on Facebook her posting birthday wishes. Everybody's on social media and talking about, oh, that this person played this role in my particular movie. Even if it's in the background, she would post a clip and talk about the person. Definitely from a place of privilege, there's no denying that. But what she's able to create in these spaces, the questions that she's able to raise, also from her students. Like she says that when she was talking about food, eating meat, defecating on stage, she was able to bring all of that in Uchakka. So there are these women who squat, and she shows them in the posture of defecating on stage, and a lot of her actors said, we will not do it. They were uncomfortable in terms of that kind of body occupying that kind of space. So what she did was that not just the actors enacting that particular part, but the entire crew, people who were doing lights, sounds, etc., were made to every day do a theatre exercise where everybody had to run on the fringes and the edges of the stage to see how does it feel to be in a precarious space in terms of the body. So she kind of, you know, brought in those kind of dynamics in her exercises, created that kind of space. I won't say that it's not a privileged position that she has as an individual in terms of her positionality, but I would definitely say that in the Indian context, to choose this kind of subject matter, to bring it to the fore within the mainstream performance spaces was something that she's doing constantly. So, you know, in 85, from Gaon se Sheher tak, to Chakka, to composition on water, to Ghode ko Jalebi, if you see, the choice of subject matter is also very deliberate, right? And she tries to show them in a social space. What is the social dimension of each of these subjects? But nevertheless, when she brings in these actors, never does she compromise on her dramaturgy in terms of allowing her actors to explore their own pedagogy, their own self, their regional specificities. So she creates that spaces using that privilege, I would say. So that definitely is something, as I would see her negotiating this question of privilege. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I had a question regarding the last kind of slide where you draw on Cruising Utopia, the book, and your comments on utopia. I think that book, at least what I have understood from it, is also reading queer spaces and queer
And drag
bodies,
bodies, yeah.
queer bodies in a space, a specific kind of sexual citizenship that is a little different maybe in the Indian context, in the cultural context, because that kind of queer context cannot be perfectly juxtaposed as to say the queering of a particular theatrical space with the bringing of a kind of queer body here. Because we have also for the longest time not seen queer bodies on stage in India, and still do not in fact see queer bodies on stage. So obviously queer versus queering, different thing, but still I think these are different contexts. So how do you see that intercultural dimension of queering, since you draw upon Cruising Utopia, and cruising itself is such a kind of spatial mobility, you know, you're walking, and there might be very interesting relationships with the kind of walking that you draw in Haksa. Yeah, but I wanted to push you a little bit on that intercultural queer context, and that's the thing, no, that in the book it's always about a performance of utopia and a performance of failure.
Yeah.
It's some kind of a dimension within it, within which these performances happen, utopia and failure. So yeah, that was the question.
Thank you for that question. I just came to that last slide because, you know, wanted to explain this, but I've used this in my work in other spaces to talk about. So it's interesting because this whole word queering is something that you will see that she will use in some of her interviews and conversations. But the whole idea of allowing a certain kind of potentiality that she talks about in terms of cruising spaces, walks, because what her work also does is that it kind of talks a lot about how people, you know, how certain spaces are constructed and how people those spaces, how do they negotiate those spaces, how do they walk those spaces. Definitely she's not talking about queer body in terms of her particular work, but how I was trying to read that temporal spaces that she tries to build in this particular performance by bringing in Esteban was also to talk about a certain kind of utopian performativity, not in terms of a failure and utopia per se, to draw that kind of dialectic, but also to talk about the whole history of doing. You know, that is something that she sees in the horizon. Like, for example, in this particular movie, she doesn't end the movie on a sad note saying that, look, this is the particular condition of these bodies, that people, these spaces, and they're suffering, and, you know, we should do something about it. That's it. It is not moralistic. She's not trying to be didactic and guide you towards this beautiful ideal where everybody will come together. And it kind of links to Professor Dutt's question that how do they take that agency or that privileged position here, but rather what she shows through the aspect of dream and social dementia is that this utopic idea of what they are thinking about, these people, these inhabitants, there is a social dimension to these dreams, that how in the Indian context, it's not Western hegemonic narrative of a Freudian psychoanalysis, even in terms of the body. So she's somebody who in this particular movie, especially towards the end, shows all of them rejoicing. So there is like music, and there are children on the street who use various objects like pans and pots to create music. And that's how the movie ends. You know, it ends with trying to talk about possibilities. It talks about potentialities, that can new spaces be created? Can new spaces of cultural exchange and dialogue be introduced, where it's not limited to a particular kind of body of work or particular kind of space, which is kind of identitarian in terms of its delegation to that spaces. So for me, Monos, here I use it in this context also because she often uses the word that, you know, we were cruising through all of this, and the idea is, you know, not to create this kind of utopia, but also not to talk about failure of these people, rather, you know, show it in a celebratory tone, that how do dreams then factor into these spaces, you know. So that was the context. Thank you.